Welcome to the Why We Fight podcast. I'm your host, Justin Stam. If you're looking for truth, political clarity, and a strong path forward to fight for the survival of Western civilization, then you're in the right place. If not, then catch up, get with the program, or go piss off. We're done with diplomacy. We're in the middle of a war, and you're either with us or against us. This is Why We Fight. If you want to contribute directly to my work, follow me on Twitter X and you can tip me with either cash or Bitcoin, or you can subscribe by going to my Subscribestar page at Why We Fight Podcast with Justin Stam. And you can choose 3 different tier levels to contribute to this important work. But whatever you decide to do, thank you for listening. I appreciate all of my listeners. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome back to the Why We Fight podcast. I'm your host, Justin Stam. This is going to be more of a conversational podcast today. I'm going to go over as much as I can on this subject of Codename Zorro, something that's part of my life for at least 23 years, and we tried to get this done as a movie for a long time. It covers the grounds of the conspiratorial, it covers geopolitical, it touches on mafia, but more or less it touches on questions pertinent to constitutional rights and deeper philosophical questions like does the government have the right over your life and so forth. So we're going to dive right in. You guys like my Life is War shirt? I blame Pat McNamara for that, so I thought it was pretty cool. Life is war. Be a weapon, not a target. That was a plug for him, by the way. So Codename Zorro is something that I'm known for. It's still on my IMDb, even though I burned the bridge to Hollywood. I don't plan on going back and trying to do, especially something like this, because they don't want to hear it. Codename Zorro was the code name given to Martin Luther King Jr. In the Cointel or counterintelligence program, the FBI, who ran domestic intelligence. And when they ran that and they were investigating due to the House of Un-American Activities, which is basically a Senate hearing that investigated over a long period of time, over decades, since after World War I, different individuals that were involved with radical groups, anarchist groups, communist groups connected to the Soviet Union in some way. And so by the time the formal Cointellpro program was developed in 56, I believe, that was about the same time that King and the Civil Rights Movement emerged, as we know it. Now, we know that Philip Randolph and others had been involved with the civil rights causes before NAACP and so forth preceded that. But 56, 57, 58 were extremely tantamount points in the whole civil rights movement and the cultural change being pushed by the globalists, by the think tanks, by the deconstructionists, because that's when the Montgomery bus boycott started. That's when the lunch line started, the integrations of the schools. They demanded that the integration of the school began and so forth. So this is a cultural shift, and it didn't happen in the early 60s. It began in the late 50s, mid to late 50s. So codename Zorro, as I came to find out, being Zorro being fox in Spanish, was the codename given to King by the FBI after they followed him and found out about a lot about his personal life. And of course, fox in Spanish means a colloquial term assigned to somebody that is a sexual deviant. And that's what they assigned him as. So, and we'll cover that in a little while, but I'll go over how I developed this whole story, how I ran across it, and the time period that I developed it in. So, and I'll break it down into a few different parts. Now, I will point out, this is very interesting and fortuitous that Tucker Carlson just interviewed this past week Vince Ellison, and he completely eviscerated King and not all, but a lot of the civil rights movement due to the fact that so many were involved both with the Communist Party USA, other Soviet and communist organizations, socialist Marxist organizations. And somebody tries to say they're different, it leads to the same thing, okay? And at the same time, ironically, as a lot of them were also on the payroll of the FBI. So Why would that occur? Why would internationalist bodies, and we'll cover this later, but why would internationalist bodies like the Tavistock, like the Rand Corporation, like the intelligence organizations, like the international banks, be involved with even pre-Operation Gladio international operations, as pointed out by Anthony Sutton's book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and how they funded the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And how during the Cold War, Anthony Sutton pointed out and documents in this book with State Department records that we were giving foreign aid to the Soviet Union by the billions. At the peak was about 1976 or 77 in the amount of 40 billion. And these are a lot of the companies, and I've had this is probably printed out in 1999. So this is an appendix of this book before I had this book. And it documents all these companies: Acme, Alice Commerce, American Can Company, American Chain, Dow Chemicals, Douglas Aircraft, Coma Corporation, Ford Motor Corporation, Honeywell, all these companies, Bechtel. Why was the U.S. government not only allowing private corporations to have factories in the Soviet Union while we were in a Cold War with them, also while we were at war with North Korea? Or I should say the communists in Korea before it became North Korea, and in Vietnam. I mean, Bechtel ended up building roads in Flora Daniel, if I remember right, building roads for Russia, sending over Caterpillar and John Deere parts that got turned into tanks and other types of weapons that were used against our own men. So that's the geopolitical implication there. So that is something that I'll touch on in a little while. So first part is I'm going to explain what the subject of Codename Zorro is about and what the Cointellpro program is about. The second thing is I'll discuss how I discovered the storyline for the script that I wrote for the screenplay, and how it involved William Sullivan. I'll go over also the general overview of the storyline as I wrote it, and that would be this script right here. And some of you guys have seen pictures I've posted on my Twitter feed about this. I've discussed it several times. This was my first draft with all the problems and warts and all. Registered with the Writers Guild Association, of course, 2001. Okay, same year as 9/11 happened, 2001. So this particular script I passed around before I started making more copies, so I've had it for that long. Okay, so I'll go over the storyline in general. I'm going to name my source contacts, which I've never done on this story, and some honorable mentions as well. And the last thing I'm going to go over is what the story really is about and what are the geopolitical implications, something I just touched on a little bit, but I'll go into it more so. So what is Codename Zorro? What is this story about? So I mentioned about Codename Zorro being the name that was given to King. I don't know how early on. Actually, it's not very clear because a lot of the declassified records are still redacted. We know for sure that somebody I mentioned before in another podcast named William Sullivan took over in 1962 or 3. It might have been 61. And he was the head of domestic intelligence and led the Cointellpro. Now, he did not want to actually go after King. He thought he might have been a good influence, but he didn't know a whole lot about King. He just knew about his public image, his PR. Hoover had already known about it, as well as Alan Belmont and Deloach. And so when Sullivan took over, one of the first things he had to do was follow King and put him under surveillance. And it took about 2 weeks in his own personal words. And he didn't talk about it much in this particular book, My 30 Years in Hoover's FBI. He didn't talk about his personal discretions and his personal habits, meaning King's personal habits. But it did come out in the church committee that I mentioned before too, where he had thought that after following him for a while and listening and surveilling him in private hotel rooms and so forth, that he was a completely degenerate person, one of the most degenerate people he's ever seen. Now, that's not my opinion. That's just what he said on record. And because he took that stance, a lot of people destroyed William Sullivan's character. But did he have a point? And should we conflate that with what King was involved in And does that really matter? And a lot of people say no. And so we'll go over that. But again, this is not about the civil rights movement. It's not even really about King. This is not a King story. Yeah, so that's what Codename Zorro was about. Codename Zorro was about the last 10 years that William Sullivan was in the FBI from 61 to 71. He was in there 30 years, but the last 10 years, he was the head of domestic intelligence. He handled all the Cointellpro. So Cointellpro was a program that I mentioned was developed in 56 or so, but it did do a lot of good. It did follow around a lot of Russian agents, Soviet assets, Soviet influence, and so forth. And we know that that occurred because you had Operation Chaos, Operation Naomi, Operation Artichoke, all these different operations that were infiltrating the university system, the school system, the media. It was very in vogue to study about communism objectively because, or in the 1950s and the early 60s amongst the intellectual circles. And they thought it was really cool to do that because it talked about social injustice, right? And so because of there was an involvement with the spreading of, this isn't really well talked about by a lot of people, but I'll just go into it really quick. Because the intelligence organizations and the Pentagon, the War Department that turned into the DoD, were very much involved with the Soviet Union before World War II, they had a relationship with them. Now we know it went into the Cold War after that, but as I just demonstrated, there was a continuing partnership on a corporate level, on a monetary level, but there was a Cold War, not a hot war, regarding weapons hot and shooting at each other. So how can you have the U.S. government stopping international intelligence that was handled by the CIA, and domestic intelligence that was supposed to be handled by the FBI, where one arm, CIA, was in bed with and cooperating with foreign intelligence? And sometimes under Operation Gladio and Underworld, working with Mafia and Marxist socialist revolutionaries, and at other times propping up fascist organizations, right? It's a huge chess game. I won't go into all of it, but it's important to know that that actually occurred. Now, domestically, it was hard for the CIA to operate, or any other organization to operate on U.S. soil without having an attachment with a domestic agency. A domestic agency didn't have to be FBI. Oftentimes it was a local sheriff, local police, and it could have happened. And it did happen. We know that with like the meta drug operation and so forth. So how that affected the domestic operations in America was that the culture changed that Hoover's FBI was fighting because he was more conservative, no matter what his personal life was like. He was still part of a general organization with the stonecutter groups to move America and move the West towards a gradual outcome of ecumenism, of a libertarian-style neoconservative type of world, right? So it's just gradual revolution rather than rapid revolution. And the butting of the heads between the intelligence organizations of the CIA and the FBI happened a lot because the CIA oftentimes did not ask. And it got to such a bad point where the FBI would stop domestic illegal operations, and they would actually be forced into I forgot the name of the organization, but basically it was a shared intelligence board. And NSA, CIA, Army intelligence, Naval intelligence, Air Force intelligence all had a conference room where they would sit there from the same year that William Sullivan became the head of the Domestic Intelligence Division, Division 5, I think it was. Ironically, Hoover never showed up for those meetings, and it was Sullivan that always showed up. And as a side point, it was kind of funny because once the conference room was created, and I think it was held at the Pentagon, all the different intelligence agencies had their symbols, had their signs, their medallions on the walls behind the seat of every department head that was there. But Hoover made sure that the FBI was the head of the meeting and therefore had the largest, like a grotesquely bigger medallion that would sit behind the chair of where Sullivan would sit. So that's just a side point. So that's what you're dealing with. So when I asked the question, what is Codename Zorro? Codename Zorro was more than just King. There were arrests. There were Russian agents that were arrested. But as Sullivan pointed out, he pointed out that he did not actually think that the Soviet foreign operations in America were that much of a threat. He documented how oftentimes they would arrest Soviet agents and let them go not too long after that. He actually thought, and he butted heads with Hoover on this, and it shows you that Sullivan was not part of the secret orders. He was not part of the secret fraternities like Hoover was. Hoover was a stonecutter. He was a first degree and a 32nd degree, and he got his 33rd degree and 32nd by blackmailing different politicians in Washington, D.C. to force their hand for his promotion. Whereas before he was suppressed because he had used a lot of dirt on others. Because, look, Hoover ran the FBI for, I believe, 50 years. And the FBI was the single federal agency that vetted every federal employee, whether it's the Pentagon, FBI, CIA, anybody that's a federal employee would have to do a background check. And that involved directly a dossier built on every federal employee by Hoover. Now, you would think it would be because you have to do a background check to make sure they're okay, they're not a felon, they don't have any history of problems and so forth. But the way Hoover used it, he began building a dossier in case he needed anybody to be used as an asset later in life. So one guy that's a junior agent one day could be the division head the next day, and you would need something out of him. And that's how he used all the information that he gathered on people. It was actually pretty genius how he did it. Kind of marvel at his entire architecture. And so again, that's how we establish the story of Codename Zorro. And I'm going to say it again, it's not about the civil rights movement. It's not about King, although I had to delve very deeply into the entire history of the civil rights movement and all the organizations. And that leads me to the second point I'm going to make, what it is not. It's not about King. So in researching about how Sullivan dealt with Hoover, and what led to his climax of him leaving in 1971 and hoping that Nixon at that time was going to appoint him as the head of the FBI and remove Hoover. How it got to that point was on his exit conversation that he had. And this goes into the civil rights thing in a minute. This is the last conversation he had on his way out the door on September 30th, 1971, with Hoover. He says, so he was relating the story about his conversation with Hoover in his office. I've never received such a letter since I've been the director of the FBI, and nobody has ever spoken to me like this before. So he was butting heads with them, and he was telling them how it was and how corrupt he was. It was time that he stepped down. Staring down at my memorandum before him on the desk, Hoover said, I've been giving this controversy between us a good deal of prayer. The old fraud, invoking prayer. That was a first for him. Several days later, thinking back on the meeting, I realized that I should have said, Mr. Hoover, let's both kneel down right here, right now, and pray together. What I did tell him was that he ruled the Bureau by fear, and that men along in years who had served faithfully in the FBI lived in dread of him. I added that I no longer intended to be intimidated. I told him everything I'd been wanting to tell him since I was a new agent. When I finished, he grew red and began to sputter and stammer. Finally, he shouted, It's very clear that you have no faith in my leadership. Yes, I replied. Nothing could be more clear than that. You no longer have any faith in my administration. I agreed again. Right. I think you'd be doing the country a great service if you retired. Well, I don't intend to, Hoover shot back, his eyes still on my letter. Senator Green stayed on in the Senate until he was 90 years of age. Hoover paused to let that sink in. Finally, for the first time, he looked up and our eyes met. I've taken this up with the Attorney General Mitchell, and he agrees with me that it is you who should be forced out. I've discussed this matter with President Nixon, and he also agrees. I walked out. The next morning, I couldn't get into my office. The locks had been changed. My name had been removed from the door. After 30 years in the FBI, I was out. So, of course, there was another section that I didn't bookmark, but he says, well, you certainly aren't Jesus Christ. So it's ironic to hear William Sullivan talking this way to him and why he was not privy to everything that Hoover knew, even after he got into the third position of domestic intelligence and so forth. William Sullivan was a Democrat, actually. Closer to a Barry Goldwater type of Democrat, if you might think of it like that, but he was also an Irish Catholic. And so at that time, if anybody knows about this, Catholics can't be part of Masonic organizations, stonecutter organizations. So that's what happened with him, is that he was always on the out of being able to get all the information, both out of Hoover, and Hoover knew that. Hoover kept Sullivan, and that's why he had him in domestic intelligence. He knew that he could control him, and that's the general point. But on the matter of the civil rights movement, I went and found out as much as I could about King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, I think David J. Garrow is not a great historian. Well, he documents what happens, and I've had this book for probably 22 years. You can see I read it cover to cover. I marked every page that I possibly could to find out what was important on this subject. But I built up my own little dossier on the different organizations from 1955 onward, everything from the National Security Council, Department of Justice, the intelligence organizations, Kissinger and his influence, because Kissinger was he was probably the single most important person in generating foreign policy for the intelligence organizations, more so than Congress, for many years, out of his Council on Foreign Relations group. The chronology of events of everything he went through from birth, when he went to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which his father was the head of. His real name was Michael, not Martin Luther King Jr., the third. So more and more I came to find out that his entire the entire chronology of the civil rights movement was very much at an intersection with different groups that were being propped up. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was propped up by people that were different than, say, Philip Randolph, who had been around since 1941, or actually, 1941, I think. He was the founder of the Sleeping Car Porters Union and the Nation Negro Congress, right? These are all different names that you wouldn't know unless you did a ton of research on these groups. Nelson Rockefeller, he was directly involved with the funding of many of King's book campaigns. I came to find out that King was not the author of his own books. He was very much involved with Stanley Levison, codenamed Solo, and that was the Cointellpro file that was kept on him by the FBI. And he was out of New York, and he had a lot of contact with Cuba and Russia. Well, he actually wrote the March on Washington speech for King. In fact, he wrote every, not just him, but mainly him, every speech that King gave. He was somewhat of his handler. And as we're coming to find out more and more what that means, more and more people are willing to talk out about what that means regarding Stanley Levison was both a communist and he was an Israeli citizen. He had direct ties to not just the intelligence organizations that were in opposition to the FBI domestically, but he was connected to the Mossad. Okay, so he was looked at later on by a lot of black civil rights leaders as King's handler. Not my words, okay? I'm just documenting what I put together on here. So, of course, you have the SNCC history, and SNCC was developed by John Lewis after the SCLC didn't move fast enough, he said. And, of course, John Lewis took in guys that were more radical, willing to get violent eventually, and like Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael changed his name to Kwanzaa Fumier and started the Black Panthers. Now, the Black Panthers were started because the Democrats always promised rights and promised all this other stuff to the black community, and they never got it. So they said, we're going to start our own voting bloc. And the Black Panthers only simply started out not as a terrorist organization. They started out as a voting bloc, their own party, their own representation. And so eventually, because of FBI informant infiltration, they got them to commit acts of violence, and eventually they formed into what we know the Black Panthers as in history. And so that again, that's a side point. So I'm just showing you all the different people that a lot of you guys out there would not even know who they are. Samuel Williams, Medgar Evers. We know about Medgar Evers. Stanley Levison, I already put that there. Baird Rustin, I'll talk about him in a minute. Dorothy Cotton, Andrew Young, Roy Wilkins, all these different characters. So they were all involved, but they all had their own little agendas. And to focus directly on King, we can talk somewhat about who his biggest funder was. Now, his biggest funder from the time that he received his Nobel Prize was Nelson Rockefeller. So the Rockefeller family and their involvement with internationalist operations had a great interest on the domestic effect that King would have. And so they tapped him. And when he got his Nobel Prize, he got sent out, he got free access to Nelson Rockefeller's private jet. And from that time onward, he was able to pretty much fly wherever he wanted, right? On the notes of the civil rights movement itself, King was accused by Hoover several times of committing all types of acts of fraud. For instance, if they got the nonprofit organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they received money, and he went on a vacation to the Caribbean, or he went in some book tour or a speech tour. The problem is that he was being recorded the whole time, both on the plane, and he didn't know that, kind of like an Epstein setup. But also the contention with Hoover was that he was taking nonprofit money and hiring hookers, and this was admitted by Ralph Abernathy, his closest friend. It was admitted by King in a Playboy interview in 64 or 65, if I remember right. And he said specifically, I'm on the road 28 days out of the month, so effing is a form of stress relief. So he said it on record himself that he was a philanderer, he was a cheater, serial cheater, which is why they gave him the name of Zorro, codename Zorro. So this information was used later on against him, and I'll go into that later on. But this is exactly what led to a lot of the downfall of many of these guys and why they became controlled. And eventually, King wanted both things. He wanted to do what he wanted. He wanted to run around, but he also wanted to say what he wanted to say. And they don't like it when somebody... You don't have to agree with his morality. You don't have to agree with his politics and so forth. But he refused to bend a knee. And we'll go into exactly what happened and, in my opinion, who killed him. And I can definitively say I don't believe, and I almost 100% can prove that James Earl Ray was not the killer. More importantly, why was he killed? What was he doing and saying at the time of his death on April 4th, 1968, right? And it runs right into the geopolitical scheme, not just domestic scheme. Okay, so we'll go into that later. So the story itself and how I ran across it was developed not too long after I met Jimmy Alo, Uncle Jimmy, in 1996. And in fact, when I first met him, I asked him about what he thought about doing a story about the assassination of Martin Luther King. Somebody like him was pretty happy about the fact that 1991, the JFK movie came out by Oliver Stone. He was really happy about the idea that something like, even though it's kind of kooky to his age group, the X-Files came out in 1993. And this is his first time period in post-World War II American history where you had self-critical, well, I wouldn't say the first time, but the first time in many years. Years before, in the 1970s, you had exploratory committees as well as investigations of the Senate committees, like the Church Committee I mentioned before, investigating CIA wrongdoing, DOD wrongdoing, all types of stuff. And then out of that, you've got things like Robert Ludlum's books, The Bourne Identity. Then you got All the President's Men, and you got 3 Days of the Condor, and so forth. But for a long time, that died out. And the only thing that was allowed to be talked about for the longest time was the Watergate scandal, and that Nixon was the worst criminal and conspiratorial criminal in the history of mankind. As we find out later on, no, he was like the least. He was like a level 1. So in the early 90s, when many of these things started coming out again, exploring whether or not the government has lied to us, it's time to come clean. Let's just heal as a country. We can talk about this stuff. Let's just stop doing this. I lived through that time period. I was young, but I lived through that time period. And I saw how a lot of people felt that way too. So you had the nut jobs that came up with crazy stuff like aliens, all the way to the guys that just wanted to be rational and say, let's open up the books and find out what really happened with JFK. Because JFK, the movie, doesn't really answer that. What really happened with RFK when he was killed? Did Sirhan really kill him? What about Martin Luther King? Did James Earl Ray really kill him? And I kept on asking, well, why would they be killed? What was the reason of killing them? I'm less concerned about who killed him rather than why. And so in doing so, when I met Uncle Jimmy and I asked him about, what do you think about doing a story about Martin Luther King? What do you think the first thing that he said to me would be? He turned to me and he says, are you going to talk about all the white women? First thing out of his mouth, are you going to talk about all the white women? So it was a well-known fact. Both mafioso, intelligence guys, local cops, FBI, everybody was wiretapping each other. There was a lot of it. In fact, there was no law up until, I forgot what year it was, but the federal wiretapping laws weren't even passed until I think at least the late 60s, if not the early 70s. One of my shortcomings I don't remember that on. But the fact is you could put anybody under surveillance. You could plant a wiretap in anybody's phone. You could put a shotgun microphone outside of anybody's open window and record them and then try to blackmail them with it. Now, blackmail was illegal, but the recording was not. And so there was a reason why King was recorded, as well as other people, tons of people. JFK was recorded. He was a philanderer. RFK and all these other guys. We know what happened with Judith Exner and Marilyn Monroe and all these people. Of course, what happened with J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson, his friend. So it's not as if somebody was coming out in the power circles as these moral exemplars. It was what you could get away with, both what you were doing and the people that recorded them and how they could get away with blackmailing them and using it, right? And so when you had this entire time period, that's why he said what he said. And he went on to say, yeah, well, we had other conversations about his knowledge of it, and that went into part of the story, and I'll name that as one of the source material sources. So that was his response. And so we had obtained from King's lawyer, William Pepper, one of his stories, and one of his stories that he wanted to talk about King's assassination regarding the Lorraine Motel, what the events led up to that, and there was a book called Murder in Memphis with Mark Lane. There were some other guys that were, like Dick Gregory, were trying to talk about that. But I felt like they were too narrowly focused on what happened in Memphis that led up to the killing. I wanted to know the entire expansive worldview that led up to that. What was the train wreck? And which is why I went into the entire history of the Civil Rights Movement, why I went into the entire history of the domestic intelligence, as well as the House of Un-American Activities operations. Of course, the CIA and their operations throughout the world, too. But what I came to find out was, and I mentioned this in a podcast, that in the church committee, there were 3 people that were killed, and I mentioned them. And they were murdered before they could testify. But the church committee caused the Senate and other congressional bodies to say, well, the church committee, you've had a lot of people reporting on CIA, FBI wrongdoing, mafia involvement, killing people, destroying evidence and information. But what we've also come to find is you guys really, the FBI really screwed up the JFK and RFK murders and MLK murders. So they decided to start their own House Select Committee that was to convene in 1977, if I remember right. 77, right? And there were several federal witnesses that were going to be called to testify. And surprisingly, what I came to find out was William Sullivan was one of these people on the list of people that died mysterious deaths before the House Select Committee investigation could call them up to testify. Now, I've had this printed out since 1999. This is a list of all these names, all these checkmark names. These are all names of people that were about to testify but died, whether just accidentally, normally, or by mysterious deaths. William Pauli, former Brazilian ambassador connected to anti-Castro Cubans, crime figures, gunshot ruled suicide. George McMorenshilt, close friend to both Oswald and Bouvier family. CIA contract agent, gunshot wound, ruled suicide. This has all happened in 1977, like right before they were to testify. Carlos Prio Sacaras, former Cuban president, money ran for anti-Castro Cubans, gunshot wound, ruled suicide. Louis Staples, Dallas radio talk show host who told friends he would break assassination case. Gunshot to head, ruled suicide. Lewis Nichols, former number 3 man in FBI, worked in JFK assassination, sudden heart attack. Alan Belmont, although I don't think this is anything to worry about. He died of a lung illness, but he was also supposed to testify. James Cadigan, FBI document expert who witnessed or who testified to the Warren Commission. He fell in his home and died from the fall. Francis G. Powers, UT pilot, downed over Russia in 1960. He died of a helicopter crash. I don't think that's connected, but all these people, they were all going to testify. These weren't just regular federal employees, whether it's FBI or military or whatever. So FBI, JFK's closest aide, Kenneth Odell, he died of natural causes right before he was supposed to testify. Donald Kaler, FBI fingerprint chemist, heart attack right before. J.M. English, former head of FBI Forensic Sciences Laboratory, sudden heart attack. And of course, 1177, of course that would be November. Former number 3 in FBI, headed Division 5 Counter Espionage and Domestic Intelligence Division, William C. Sullivan, died of a hunting accident. So I thought that was weird. Now, he made it to the church committee and he talked about things like what they did to King. He disagreed with destroying people's character, even if he had disagreed with their personal life. He did call King a degenerate, one of the worst he'd ever seen in his life. He put him under surveillance, and he would know more than anybody because of his team putting him under surveillance. However, he still stood up for the same issue that I brought up before. We don't have the right under the Constitution to just surveil, copy, harass, and follow and harass, and then threaten to kill. And I'll read a letter from the FBI, what that has to do with King on. But I thought it was very interesting that I ran across that and I began researching about William Sullivan's life, and that's when I discovered his book. Wow, I thought that's interesting. Okay, so how did he die, and how did he get shot in a hunting accident? Well, Jim Marrs, of all people, Jim Marrs is an old school conspiracy theorist. He's got some nutty ideas about aliens and building ancient civilization. It's kind of dumb if you ask me. But he does do some other research, because I don't practice this whole genetic fallacy where everything a person does is wrong just because they're nutty on some things. He was one of the chief researchers for the JFK book called Crossfire that Oliver Stone used to make the movie JFK. And so he's not totally discounted as a crazy, but he had a commentary on William Sullivan's death, and he quoted a newspaper article in New Hampshire, Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, that I printed out many, many years ago. And how William Sullivan died 2 weeks before he was supposed to appear before the House Select Committee was he was mistaken for a deer and shot in the head by the son of the state troopers. You understand how weird that sounds? The son of the head of the state troopers, Trooper John Thull, and myself measured the distance from the shooter to the 2 rifles that laid on the ground 15 feet from the victim to be 241 feet. So at 241 feet, they mistook William Sullivan's head for a deer. Trooper Robert Daniels was at the scene in the cruiser. Well, maybe I should just start at the beginning. I received a call from Troop F, New Hampshire State Police, via telephone saying a hunting accident near Brown residence at Sugar Hill. Time approximately 6:35 a.m. I then called Lieutenant William Radio to say ambulance en route. I arrived on the scene. So this is just the documentation of probably the police report. So He was shot with a .30-06 in the head. I thought, wow, that is freaking crazy. How does a third in position in the FBI, who was head of domestic intelligence, get killed 2 weeks before he was supposed to appear before the House Select Committee? And I began researching and asking the question, was he in fear that he may not make it? Was he in fear that he couldn't testify as he wanted to, and he did in the church committee, and what that might have led to? Well, the more research I did and the more FOIA requests that I made, I personally made a lot of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. I wanted to see if the government really was locking up this information. What I came to find out that is that William Seldom was the last that I know of the federal witnesses that were going to be used as testimony to reinvestigate this story. Now, I mentioned before, I don't trust David J. Garrow. I don't trust Taylor Branch. I don't trust any of these guys that have put out conflicting stories regarding not just King's life, both at one hand saying he wasn't a communist, while at the same time, if you read Testimony of Hope, it has a documentation of all of his speeches and I don't have it right here, but all of his speeches and all of his books. And in the latter two books, at least the last one, he said that he was a Marxist socialist and that he wanted to see America become some type of a blend between capitalism and socialism. Okay, so you can't deny what came out of his own mouth. It's like the people saying that he wasn't a cheater. He didn't cheat on Coretta Scott King. Yet he said, and Ralph Abernathy said, and other people verified that he did. So the House Select Committee went on and did their own investigations. But going into private session, they went ahead and made a conclusion after the entire investigation that JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. were killed as part of a larger conspiracy, not just by single shooters, meaning Lee Harvey Oswald and James Earl Ray. They were killed as part of larger conspiracies. Okay? Then they locked away the information until 2029 and would not be available for public viewing until then. Well, some of the people in the 80s and 90s got really pissed about that, and they went ahead and began filing mass FOIA requests and got denied every single time. Well, one of the only good things that Ted Kennedy ever got done correctly in his entire life was he led up this committee that wanted to open these papers, these sealed documents up sooner, okay? And the foundation that was started was called the Mary Farrell Foundation. I don't need to go into why that was called that then. And the foundation actually got an early release of the documents that were stored by the 1977 House Select Committee. And when the Mary Farrell Foundation opened up the books to actually see what was hidden from the public, they got a glimpse of what they were waiting for until 2029. And it looked a lot like this. Page after page after page after page after page, redacted, 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 redacted. Now, this is just one section of the Stanley Levison House Select Committee. I had this sent to my front door, okay? Many years ago. And so this is under a FOIA request. So they had to give it, especially because of the Mary Farrell Foundation. Well, I didn't get this from the Mary Farrell Foundation. I got it from the federal government, okay? That was Stanley Levison, codename Solo, the head of the Communist Party USA out of New York. That was Martin Luther King's handler. Okay, so I have a file, a digital file that has tons and tons of letters and internal memos. Communist Party USA, Negro Question, Communist Influence in Racial Matters, documenting, look at this, September 25th, 1963. Communist Party USA, on and on and on. They document, as much as we don't like the corrupt FBI under Hoover, and we like to vilify everything Hoover did, he actually documented. He had his divisions document very clearly, letter after letter, declassified memo. Not everything was completely redacted, but when it gets to his killing and the direct involvement that Stanley Levison had with the Mossad, then it was redacted, ironically. Okay, so that's what you have. That's what we came to find out. We were going to wait for until 2029. And then we were going to be all enlightened by the release of the information of the Mary Farrell Foundation, only to find out what? It was redacted anyway. So my question was always, well, what are you hiding? And that led me on this research, this pursuit of research to find out why is it that Sullivan was not allowed to testify? Why was it that JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King were not allowed to criticize the war in Vietnam? Why was that? Right? And that is really the crux of the issue. And it gets to the point where you realize that there's larger geopolitical issues involved. But before I get into the geopolitical issues, I wanted to mention how, when I talk about this subject, why I can speak about it with authority. And not that I am the appeal to authority or I'm the point of authority or principle of unity. I wouldn't claim that. But what I'm saying is that I didn't just read this stuff in books, okay? And I came to find out that it's important to understand that Operation Mockingbird, that operated for decades, oftentimes puts out stories that are not meant to lead you to the truth, but away from the truth. Just like the House Select Committee was meant to lead you away from the truth rather than to the truth. Nobody was in trouble after the House Select Committee was convened, okay? Even the King family came out many years later and said, Martin Luther King's son said, what? We don't believe that James Earl Ray killed my father, okay? And years later, and I'll mention this in a minute, years later when we had Wesley Snipes involved with helping raise the money and hopefully make the movie of Codename Zorro, they, along with Dan Meacham, got the involvement of the King family, and they completely endorsed it. They had a letter sent to us. I'm not going to show the letter. And they agreed that there should be more effort to talk about why he was killed, not just who. And they appreciated that we were doing this. Of course, we weren't just doing this for them. Like I mentioned before, we're doing this for a principle of justice, and that you can't just have a government run amok that can just go around doing whatever they want. And isn't that even more so important now, what we see them doing now? Okay, so I'm going to go into mention a few key figures that were involved with the development of our story, and they were used as source figures from that world, meaning whether it be the intelligence, mafia, and military. So first and foremost would be Jimmy Alo. And I already mentioned about what our conversation was initially, and he was involved with answering some questions later on. Tommy Sobek, of course, he was with Jimmy, and I already mentioned him in the podcast about the assassination of Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. Tommy Amato. Tommy Amato is somebody I haven't mentioned before. Well, Tommy Amato was actually the cousin to Joe Bonanno. Joe Bonanno was one of the founding family heads of the Mafia Commission back in the old days when they took out the Mustache Pete's, okay? And Tommy Amato was his cousin. Now, I met Tommy Amato a couple times when he was still living in Sherman Oaks, and I attended his funeral with my mother and a friend of ours named Anise Parker. And when he had passed away finally, huge funeral. At that time, I had never been into a Catholic church before that, so I had never experienced the getting up and sitting down and kneeling so many times. And but it was sad to see him go, because towards the end of his life, he really did try to straighten up his life in a lot of ways. Went to mass every day, did confession all the time. Really realized a lot of the things that he did were against what he hoped for in the next life. So, but he was very much involved with the King issue. And as he revealed to us, which is why somebody said we should go talk to him, that he was the one that obtained the payment. Tommy Amato was the one that obtained the payment from an intel operative to hire and pay the hit team that killed King. And it was not James Earl Ray. Okay, that was out of the mouth of Tommy Amato. And we were told by Uncle Jimmy and Tommy Sobek to go and see him about this, because I was developing this story. That's why. He also explained about other Mafia CIA operations that were involved in things I mentioned before, like Operation Gladio and Underworld. Somebody else that was involved, and I mentioned several times before, is Tony Appennazzano. Hey, Tony. Tony is a family friend and has spent a lot of time with different figures in the underworld because of being Frank Sinatra's road manager for 14 years after Jelly Rizzo died. But he also had his own childhood friends that grew up in that world as well. Fifth person is Mike Falco. I mentioned him before. I ran some of my interviews of him and him talking. He was a made wise guy and was involved with Joe Colombo and several others. He had two uncles that were family bosses. Knew quite a bit. Wasn't very high level, but knew quite a bit that happened. Here's somebody else I hadn't mentioned before either. Number 6 is Chucky O'Brien. He was the foster son of Jimmy Hoffa and Teamster leader and messenger to the mob. And yes, I had about 45 minutes that I interviewed him on issues that happened with the Teamsters and with Jimmy Hoffa. And of course, he was the one that was accused of being the guy that was responsible for his disappearance. But he loved his father, right? And there's some contention with the family, and still he passed away already. But he was portrayed in the movie Hoffa that Jack Nicholson was in by the Danny DeVito character. Okay. So they didn't call him Chucky O'Brien, but he was the real deal. And he handled a lot of Teamster issues, and he was a go-between between the Teamsters for a long time and the mob. Somebody else, number 7, I didn't mention ever before, and that's Senator Donald T. Harding. And Senator Harding, Donald, he has passed away for some years now. He was in Colorado when he served, and he was privy to quite a bit of information on some of the intelligence operations that we talked about before too. I'll just leave it at that with him. Number 8 would be Randall Burton. I haven't talked to Randall in a long time, but I hope you're doing well. Loved your accent. He was a U.S. intelligence asset and involved in numerous operations and covert operatives, including the next 2 names I'm about to mention. 9 is Colonel Jerry Davis. He's a U.S. intel officer with high-level access to information on top-secret operations such as codename Zorro. Was able to verify at least some of the particulars of some of the things that we talked about. And the 10th one, which is the second one that Randall Burton introduced us to, which was Jorge Brown. Jorge Brown was a covert intel asset who also knew of James Earl Ray's real background. Okay. So those are some of the people that were directly involved with the story structure, verification. This is outside of actual public book knowledge. And remember, this is 23 years ago when I first started developing this. 23 years ago. 2001 was when I actually completed the first draft of that story, of the script. But I began writing and developing, really going all the way back to 96 to 98. So I'm going to mention some honorable mentions that have helped us along the way over the years. Again, this is such a large part of my life. The most formative and productive years of my life were spent trying to get this story done. And I either got people from the black community saying that they didn't like that a white guy was trying to do the story about the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I got people from the white community saying, why do you want to do a story about that? He was this, he was that. And they all missed the point that I was trying to do a story about an issue of justice, right? And some of the people that understood my message, they helped along the way, regardless of how it was received. I went to several, in fact, I think I was at every major studio and many of the minor studios and TV networks and pitched. We had raised $50 million 3 separate times to do this film. We had, and I'll mention some of them here, we had directors, signed directors, we had actors, we had producers, we had distribution contracts, we had all types of things ready to go. And just sometimes things don't line up. But as what was mentioned, and I mentioned this before in another talk, I met Oliver Stone at the Oscar party for Paul Haggis when he won for Crash. And Oliver Stone mentioned to me, and it was such a big deal to meet Oliver Stone because of this subject that I was trying to get done at the time. And my agent at the time was Larry Bexey. And Larry Bexey introduced me at this party to Oliver. And when I got to meet him, I said, such an honor to meet you. And he mentioned, well, this is Justin. This is the guy that wrote Codename Zorro, the story about William Sullivan and the Martin Luther King assassination. He goes, oh yeah, his face lights up because he knew the story. And he's well read on the subjects. So he says, he says, you can't get a movie like this done now. I did JFK in 91. That was before the liaison offices were established in Hollywood. And the liaison offices basically say that since every studio and TV network is a signatory to the intelligence organizations and the federal agencies, that they have to get approval of those federal agencies for every project that mentions those particular groups. So if you mention FBI, you mention Air Force, you mention whatever, you got to pass the script through them, and they have to sign off on it. If they don't say yes, then the studio can't do it. So the idea of independent criticism of our own agencies ended, right? It ended. And that goes towards what I was saying, that the same year that 9/11 occurred is when I completed the first draft of this story of Codename Zorro, right? Look at this, 5/2001, okay? And it was the same year 9/11 happened. So we went from this incredibly creative decade of the 1990s where all these stories were coming out and they were trying to do exposés of conspiracies and corruptions, everything from assassination of JFK to aliens like X-Files. And when I finally got the script done, that's when everything went 180. While we're fighting in the Iraq-Afghanistan war, you cannot criticize the government at all. So that all got shut down, right? And that's something that I talked about with Johnny Depp's production office manager. His name was Jeff Taplin and Sam Sarkar, and they thought it was very sad because they really wanted to do this too at one time, and but they got a lot of pressure to not do it by the liaison offices, let's just say. So I'll just mention a few of these other people that were very instrumental in trying to help us get this done. Of course, that's my mother, Diana Stam. Anise Parker. Hey, Anise. She's a film producer and television producer too, as well as a big sister. Ed Albert, he was from the Warburg banking family. And Ed has worked for major Fortune 100 companies at high levels, including American Express and the Hertz Corporation. He also was an assistant to the president of Motown Records. Shifted to the film industry and was at the 20th Century Fox studio and was a project officer during the era of Star Wars, The Omen, Julia, and Turning Point. It's got a huge list of credits. Go check him out on IMDb. Another one is Preston Holmes. He's a producer. He worked with directors like Spike Lee. Loved the story, wanted to get it done. Philip von Alvensleben, he was at Alliance Atlantis, who without him and Bill McDonald, we would never have been able to do our first press release on our story in the December 19th, 2002 Hollywood Reporter. And that was the first time we actually did a story, a press release about it. So thank you, Philip. And Bill McDonald. Bill McDonald was a producer who produced the movie The Saint with Val Kilmer, and he was also instrumental in creating the HBO TV series Rome. Catherine Koyanagi, she's an entertainment attorney. Hey, Catherine. She was very, very helpful in doing contracts with negotiations at different stages of our development. Michael Sherman. Hey, Michael. Same thing. He's an entertainment attorney. F. Gary Gray, film director who directed Friday, The Negotiator, The Italian Job, and Law Abiding Citizen. Larry Bexey. By the way, F. Gary Gray, we really appreciated him taking the time for about a year to help develop the script more. We did a couple meetings at least at his Santa Monica condo. In fact, some of the script notes are around here somewhere. But yeah, here they are. Here, this is an 07 meeting, some of our script notes. And because of the writer's strike, crushed our financing that was set up. And when the writer's strike ended, he had another film lined up and things didn't work out. Our schedules just didn't meet. So we ended up doing Law Abiding Citizen within a year after the writer's strike ended. Next one was Larry Bexey, who was my literary agent. He loved my writing. Thank you, Larry. Sorry things didn't work out. But he was also the one who discovered some people like Johnny Depp and a few other names I wouldn't drop right now. But he knew Oliver Stone really well, and he organized that we attend the Oscar party for Paul Haggis, who he represented at the time, that did the movie Crash. And when he introduced us to Oliver Stone, he really wanted to do the film, but he explained to us about the issues regarding the liaison offices in Hollywood and how you couldn't really get a movie like that done anymore. So, Bob Yari, hey Bob, that wasn't my idea to turn down the deal. Appreciated everything you did. Love you. Jenny Guevara, she was the junior agent under Larry that was assigned to us that helped us out a lot. She got out of the business, but apparently is much happier and has a great family now here in Southern California. And last but not least is Wesley Snipes, who was our partner on this project and helped raise, I believe for the third time, the money, about $50 million needed for a production, but when he went to jail, everything went bye-bye. So did a lot of work, tried to make that work out, but didn't work out in the end. And like I said, the gate became narrower and narrower to be able to tell a story about. Really, it's not about King. Like I said, it's about the criticism of the intelligence, the FBI, the federal government in general, and that's like a major no-no now, especially since the past, let's just say 8 years, I would say. So the last subject I really wanted to go over. And like I said, I'm not going to do a line-by-line item on the story itself. But what's most important is my conclusions of a lot of these things, right? I think what King stumbled upon was what many others that had been groomed and been coaxed and been wined and dined by the elites of this world that wanted to use somebody like him, and they did use him. He thought he was doing something for his own people, but as many that criticized his personal choices later on come to find out that he in a lot of ways, he was really selfish. And he made up for that by being extremely altruistic and unselfish in other parts of his life. And he had a hard time finding the balance. Now, the people that hate me for talking in any way positive about him, I'm just trying to draw a parallel on how people are used. I'm not talking about King himself. But King himself oftentimes was always involved with somebody that many in the civil rights movement identified as being against the black people in general. When he went to Crozer Theological Seminary, he had a relationship with a white woman that he was hoping he was going to marry. Well, she was hoping he was going to marry her. And the short version is they broke it off. Of course, he went to Morehouse College. But in the end, when he became the priest of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, it was documented, both him and Ralph Abernathy, his best friend, how it was a regular thing to have affairs with these young women in their churches. And it's really sad because that was at a time when the black community had a very strong connection to the black churches. And it was like the establishment, like the centerpiece of a lot of people's organization in their life. There was the strong male patriarchal characters, divorce hardly ever happened, and so forth. And so for him to get pulled in with this small church in the middle of Alabama into the international scene, and all the money and women and everything else and drugs were thrown at him, how is he supposed to scale that back? And most people don't pass that test, and he did not pass that test. And then in addition, when he made that speech in front of the UN and made a series of speeches where he criticized the war in Vietnam, then you realize how much these international groups that wanted to groom him all of a sudden abandoned him and turned against him and started backing others. And to find out who those others are without me even naming them, you could just simply ask, after he was killed, who received the most nonprofit infusions of money. You could talk about the Andrew Youngs, and you could talk about Jesse Jackson, you could talk about Al Sharpton, and all these other people that no longer screamed about who killed King or why he was killed. They were, in a lot of ways, probably threatened like the mafia tactics, like I mentioned before. Look, take this money, shut up, we'll put Martin Luther King boulevards in every major city, and look the other way, or the same thing's going to happen to you. That's probably what happened, right? So again, what was the centrifugal importance of having the Vietnam War? And when I was asked that at a meeting at the Bob Yuri production company, and Bob was the smartest guy in the room, I got to be honest with you, and I'm not kissing butt. I really agree that when he asked me the question, were we really sending foreign aid to the Soviet Union during the Cold War that they used to give to North Vietnam and Korea while we were fighting them in the 50s and 60s and 70s? And the answer was yes, and I documented it, and I proved it. And I proved it not just from what was written in the book of Stanley Levison and other sources, but the fact that the State Department records are readily available to see those things, to see those documents, right? You could go into table after table, document after document. They're not classified. They never were. And actually, this book documents also how there were congressional hearings questioning why we would be funding somebody that we're actually at a Cold War with. When you see the picture that these bankers and corporations were funding the Bolshevik Revolution, supplying through the Lend-Lease program all the way through before, during, and after World War II, Russia, even though they had a chance to take him out, even after they knew he was killing tens of millions of people, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn pointed out, that they were still doing business with him, with Russia. Right? So the human rights violations did not matter. Their atrocities were 100 times worse than whatever the Third Reich did. Yet they continued to do business with them. What was the real answer? At the time, when I was still trying to get this film done, I thought it was a simple answer of saying they were trying to bring China up from a feudal society to a developed society. So when Nixon met Deng Xiaoping and shook his hand during his presidency, where he flew out to China, and he had to lean over the red carpet in order to meet the still and stoic Deng Xiaoping, it was a symbol that was taken a picture of and shown around the Chinese and then world media. It looked like the Western capitalists were submitting to the Chinese regime, and they used that as a political propaganda tool. But in reality, they weren't wrong in the sense that America and the Western capitalist countries, they did come to China and begin doing business and took advantage of their cheap, if not slave, labor. But did Russia have that during the Soviet Union? Yes, they did. Actually, the biggest building in the world apparently was the Fiat building. The Fiat building, and that was in Russia. And they made parts and so forth. They may have assembled in Italy, but for a long time they were manufacturing them in Russia. That was just one example. There's a lot of other things that were going on. But how is it you're funding and sending military aid? And the congressional floor, there was excuses for that from the State Department saying, well, if they're starving, then it's better that we send money and we appear like we're the humanitarians than they go starving and then blame it on greedy capitalists. That's the same argument they had for North Korea. And look at North Korea. They're fully armed and you can't do anything and touch them now, right? So where's the outrage? Where's the bombing of Dresden with them to wipe them out for their injustice? There wasn't. I'm not calling for the bombing of Russia and Korea. I'm saying that their foreign policy is not consistent. When you come to find out that their foreign policy is driven by the Frankfurt School critical theory concept that white European Christian nations need to be deconstructed and dismantled and demographically replaced, then it all makes sense. That's why they don't go and bomb other countries like China, like others that violate human rights. When we hear that 60 to 80 million people were killed under Maoism and they don't do anything, in fact, they look the other way and go do business with them and have a huge wealth transfer to China, then you realize they don't care about anything, not just about money, because they could have made that money in a different way here. They care about deconstructionism. They care about deconstructionism. I've documented that very well in my Twitter channel, documented it several times in other talks I've done. That is the goal, okay? So when China opened up for business, when it opened up for trade with the West after denouncing the West, and Deng Xiaoping shook his hand, when they went to go to meet with Mao, Mao shook Nixon's hand and he says, now you know we'll still have to appear as enemies to the press. And of course, they continue to do business. So, in the grand scheme of things, what I came to the conclusion on only recently in the past few years was, and contrary to people like James Lindsay and other geopolitical commentators, the answer for fighting back against deconstructionism of the West and these ridiculous radical calls for white replacement is not more capitalism. It's not more Ron Paul openness. It's not more trade, because that's only shot us in the foot and it's a total suicidal pathway. this entire story of King, JFK, RFK, and others getting in the way of this giant geopolitical plot, and why they would do a 180 on these people that we're supporting, and as soon as you go against the war in Vietnam, we don't support, has everything to do with that very issue right there. You're interfering with our geopolitical scheme. That's the same reason why they turned on Trump. Trump was fine, but he starts talking about national sovereignty of the U.S., getting out of NATO, right? Building a border, building up our U.S. dollar strength, building up our oil reserves. You can't have any strength there. You can't have any strength in the West, okay? And that's something that King came to the conclusion of when before he was killed. He planned on doing another march on Washington. Many people don't know about this. And it was actually supposed to be in 1968. And he was going to call it the Poor People's Campaign. And he did call it the Poor People's Campaign. It took place over a period of time. But it was supposed to culminate in him having another march on Washington and bringing people of all colors. He said poverty is a transracial thing. So we can't just march. This is something that was resisted by the other civil rights leaders. We have to advocate for black people only. He says, no, poverty is a transracial thing. So we're going to bring as many people as possible to stop anybody from going in or out of the Capitol building, driving in or out of the White House, and driving on the streets on Pennsylvania Avenue, and park it there until they stop the war in Vietnam, which is exactly what Russia wanted. I'm not doing a simpleton analysis of that. I'm just saying that in the end, he wasn't serving the interests of what he thought he was, right? It is true that we shouldn't be spending billions overseas when we have injustice here in America. But when he operated in such a way that would threaten the national sovereignty and decision-making of Washington, that was both controlling domestic and foreign policy, while sending foreign aid to the Soviet Union that ended up in the hands of the Vietnamese, Korean, and Chinese, then you realize you're dealing with a huge chess game that wasn't so simple as just saying we need to end poverty in America. To him, it was about ending poverty in America and justice in America. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But that was the last straw. So when you had William Byrd, the senator, going out on the congressional floor and saying, we need to remove King from the national scene. This is actually on congressional record. I'll get a screenshot of it when I post this later on, but removing King from the national scene became a mantra amongst many people that were involved with the Arms Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Foreign Policy Committees, and so forth. And so when that call to remove him was put in place, I believe I found enough evidence to be able to say that he was getting calls to say, stop what you're doing, stop what you're doing. And it has a lot to do with the calls that were being given to him from even the FBI in the early 60s. And it went something like this. And this is a letter that was sent out after he was being surveilled, and those in the FBI were trying to replace him with Roy Wilkins of the NAACP as a better leader that didn't have such moral character issues. The letter went like this. King, in view of your low-grade, abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor, and your last name calls to mind only the type of king, such as King Henry VIII, and his countless acts of adultery and immoral conduct, lower than that of a beast. King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. White people in this country have enough frauds of their own, but I am sure they don't have one at this time that is anywhere near your equal. You are no clergyman, and you know it. I repeat, you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. You could not believe in God and act as you do. Clearly, you don't believe in any personal moral principles. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader. You, even at an early age, have turned out to be not a leader, but a dissolute, abnormal, moral imbecile. We will now have to depend on our older brothers or older leaders like Wilkins, a man of character. And thank God we have others like him. But you are done. Your honorary degree, your Nobel Prize with a grim farce, and other awards will not save you. King, I repeat, you are done. No person can overcome facts, not even a fraud like yourself. Lend your sexually psychotic ear to the enclosure. You will find yourself and all in your dirt, filth, evil, moronic talk exposed on the record for all time. I repeat, no person can argue successfully against facts. You are finished. You will find on the record for all time your filthy, dirty, evil companions, male and females, giving expression with you to your hideous abnormalities, and some of them to pretend to be ministers of the gospel. Satan could not do more. What incredible evilness. It is all there on record, your sexual orgies. Listen to yourself, you filthy, abnormal animal. You are on the record. You have been on the record. All of your adulterous acts, your sexual orgies extending far into the past. This one is but a tiny example. This came with a recording tape of him. You will understand this. Yes, from your various evil playmates on the East Coast too, and others on the West Coast and outside the country, you are on the record. King, you are done. The American public, the church organization that you have been helping, Protestant, Catholic, and Jews will know you for what you are, an evil, abnormal beast. So will others who have backed you. You are done. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It is definite, practical, significant. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. So this letter sent to him by the FBI, although nobody truly 100% knows who generated this letter, some people call it a work of William Sullivan, but that's not actually proven. I already researched this. But this is a call for him to commit suicide and remove himself from the national scene. So these are the types of letters that he got on a constant basis, both by those that truly wanted to have him dead and kill him, as well as those that had political motivation. So he was getting it from every angle, right? So he pretty much lost his protection towards the end there. And if that happened in the early 60s, what do you think was going to happen when he wanted to do a March on Washington Part 2? And so it really accelerated from there. So as a last note, I'll just say this. On the night of his death, he repeated what was being claimed in here and what has been documented with his own words and Ralph Abernathy and others, that he had a penchant for hiring hookers. So one of the stories that I got from Uncle Jimmy is that he put 2 white hookers in the hospital the night before he was shot at the Lorraine Motel. Apparently he wanted them to do some things that they weren't willing to do, and he beat the hell out of them. One of them he almost killed. So they both went to the hospital. And so that was an atrocious act unto itself. A lot of people tried to look the other way because it was an expedient to try to stop him from doing a lot of these things. Some things were not illegal, some things were. But when this happened to him, enough people hated him that they basically just looked the other way. And it's unfortunate because he could have gone a total different direction. So in the end, you can see that talking about the King story is not just about like the movie Selma, where he did all these great things and he's hailed as a saint, or he was killed by James Earl Ray, and so forth. This story, again, was not about King and the Civil Rights Movement. It was a snapshot of a changing time period in America. And I am proving that it was changing by artificial means from intelligence agencies and operations that were driven by international and domestic policies of think tanks like Council on Foreign Relations, being driven by political philosophies such as critical theory. Okay? And so people like him, in my opinion, just got caught in the middle because they thought they were going to get some kind of a fairness doctrine. And a lot of people like me growing up didn't know anything about King except for wanting to have that fairness doctrine within a liberal democracy. And that's what I wanted for all these years. That's what I wanted for all these years, is to put those two questions out. If we have a democracy, we have a free and open democracy, we have to have the truth on this matter. We have to have better racial relations based on that principle I was mentioning. But also we have to put into question, does the government, if it claims to be a democracy and it is controlled by the people according to the articles of the Constitution, does it have the right to harass, intimidate, surveil, and assassinate people that aren't even declared to be enemies of the state? Ironically, King was one of 5 people in the history of the country that was declared to be an enemy of the state. And the question is why? And it wasn't just because he was running around calling himself a communist. A lot of people were doing that, and they weren't named enemies of the state, right? So it is a difficult, large, expansive subject. I may even do a part 2 on this to go into more of the details. of the 1960s time period leading up to 71 with William Sullivan. But the long and short of it is that William Sullivan, no matter what he thought of King and what he did or was not able to do in usurping Hoover, he actually went to war with Hoover, which at that time was one of the most powerful men in America. And he was unsuccessful in being able to replace him, but posthumously, he was able to create a record where he was trying to expose the corruption, the investigative processes that were corrupted, and everything else that went on at the FBI. And unfortunately, he was just simply replaced by W. Mark Felt later on, as we came to find out. And W. Mark Felt was the one that was feeding information to destroy Nixon, and then, of course, get into the FBI and start mopping things up. So this lends itself to the modern questions of the corruption of the FBI and the CIA and so forth. And it's out of regular people's hands like me. It's out of other people's hands that are in my situation as well. I can only say what we have done in the past and what we've been able to do in the past as a nation, and whether or not we have a right and a duty to try to find the truth on issues like funding communist revolutions, funding an enemy that we end up going to war with, and also researching whether or not people of our past have been killed illegally, and then the evidence for that being hidden from us for all time to see. So that's it for now. Looking forward to seeing you next time and discussing some of these hot topics, and bye for now.